The Breadwinner by Deborah Ellis. To the Children of War. Foreword. It's been 36 years since the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It's been 26 years since their departure marked the start of the bloody civil war. It's been 19 years since the capture of Kabul by the Taliban army, and 14 years since that terrible day in September that unleashed the events leading to the Taliban's removal from power. That's an awful lot of war for a country that's barely the size of Texas. My involvement with Afghanistan began when the news of the crimes of the Taliban hit the Toronto newspapers back in 1996. Since then, I have been trying to understand what war does to people. War is made by people living in safety who make the decision to take risks with the lives of others whose opinions on the matter are not even solicited. War is made by those who profit from the manufacturing of weaponry. War is made by people who are too lazy to put the creative work and compassion into coming up with a solution to their problems that does not involve murder. I've seen the way the bombs and bullets shatter human bodies and devastate families. I've learned what happens when the destruction of infrastructure leads to bad water, food shortages, and the lack of medical care. And I've learned from refugees about how their lives have been derailed and reduced to waiting for food, for shelter, for documents, for peace. Through all the tales of crime and chaos, there have been heroes, giants of courage, who in big ways and small put human decency above all else. I've met teachers around the world who carve out little niches of safety and childhood for kids in need. I've met librarians who remind us that human beings are capable of creating things noble and sublime. I've met builders and farmers, health workers and home workers who go through incredible difficulties just to make the next day, the next hour, a little bit better for those around them. I've met parents of dead children who take in children of dead parents, raising them with love and care. And I've met children who cast aside the hatreds of the older generation and work towards building a world of radical kindness and beauty. In today's warfare, 95% of the casualties are civilians. This means that when we give our governments permission to go to war, we are giving them permission to kill people who are just like us, who complain about the weather, love their children, and wonder what to have for dinner. People who have done us no harm. Books can help us remember what we have in common as humans. That's what I try to do with mine. In this 15th anniversary edition of The Breadwinner, I would like to thank all readers who have embraced Parvana and her companions, who have followed her journey with compassion and as though she were a close friend. I thank all the teachers, librarians, and parents who have introduced the book to the readers in their care. And I thank most deeply the people of Afghanistan. They deserve, like we all deserve, to live in peace forever. Deborah Ellis, 2015. Chapter 1. I can read that letter as well as Father can, whispered Parvana into the folds of her chador. Well, almost. She didn't dare say those words out loud. The man sitting beside her father would not want to hear her voice, nor would anyone else in the Kabul market. Parvana was there only to help her father walk to the market and back home again after work. She sat well back on the blanket, her head and most of her face covered by her chador. She wasn't really supposed to be outside at all. The Taliban had ordered all the girls and women in Afghanistan to stay inside their homes. They even forbade girls to go to school. Parvana had to leave her 6th grade class, and her sister, Nuria, was not allowed to go to her high school. Their mother had been kicked out of her job as a writer for a Kabul radio station. For more than a year now, they had all been stuck inside one room along with 5-year-old Mariam and 2-year-old Ali. Parvana did get out for a few hours most days to help her father walk. She was always glad to go outside, even though it meant sitting for hours on a blanket spread out over the hard ground of the marketplace. At least it was something to do. She had even got used to holding her tongue and hiding her face. She was small for her 11 years. As a small girl, she could usually get away with being outside without being questioned. I need this girl to help me walk, her father would tell any Talib who asked, pointing to his leg. He had lost the lower part of his leg when the high school he was teaching in was bombed. His insides had been hurt somehow too. He was often tired. I have no son at home, except for an infant, he would explain. Parvana would slump down further on the blanket and try to make herself look smaller. She was afraid to look up at the soldiers. She had seen what they did, especially to women, the way that they would whip and beat someone they thought should be punished. Sitting in the marketplace day after day, she had seen a lot. When the Taliban were around, what she wanted most of all was to be invisible. Now the customer asked her father to read his letter again. Read it slowly, so I can remember it for my family. Parvana would have liked to get a letter. Mail delivery had recently started again in Afghanistan after years of being disrupted by war. Many of her friends had fled the country with their families. She thought they were in Pakistan, but she wasn't sure, so she couldn't write to them. Her own family had moved so often because of the bombing that her friends no longer knew where she was. Afghans cover the earth like stars cover the sky, her father often said. Her father finished reading the man's letter a second time. The customer thanked him and paid. I will look for you when it is time to write a reply. Most people in Afghanistan could not read or write. Parvana was one of the lucky ones. Both of her parents had been to university, and they believed in education for everyone, even girls. Customers came and went as the afternoon wore on. Most spoke Dari, the same language Parvana spoke best. When a customer spoke Pashto, she could recognize most of it, but not all. Her parents could speak English too. Her father had gone to university in England. That was a long time ago. The market was a very busy place. Men shopped for their families, and peddlers hawked their goods and services. Some, like the tea shop, had their own stalls. With such a big urn and so many trays of cups, it had to stay in one place. Tea boys ran back and forth into the labyrinth of the marketplace, carrying tea to customers who couldn't leave their own shops, then returning back with the empty cups. I could do that, Parvana whispered. She liked to be able to run around the market, to know its winding streets as well as she knew the four walls of her home. Her father turned to look at her. I'd rather see you running around a schoolyard. He turned around again to call out to the passing men. Anything written? Anything read? Pashto and Dari? Wonderful items for sale. Parvana frowned. It wasn't her fault she wasn't in school. She would rather be there too, instead of sitting on this uncomfortable blanket, her back and bottom getting sore. She missed her friends, her blue and white school uniform, and doing new things each day. History was her favorite subject, especially Afghan history. Everybody had come to Afghanistan. The Persians came 4,000 years ago. Alexander the Great came too, followed by the Greeks, Arabs, Turks, British, and finally the Soviets. One of the conquerors, Tamerlane from Samarkand, cut off the heads of his enemies and stacked them in huge piles like melons at a fruit stand. All these people had come to Parvana's beautiful country to try to take it over, and the Afghans had kicked them all out again. But now the country was ruled by the Taliban militia. They were Afghans, and they had very definite ideas about how things should be run. When they first took over the capital city of Kabul and forbade girls to go to school, Parvana wasn't terribly unhappy. She had a test coming up in arithmetic that she hadn't prepared for, and she was in trouble for talking in class again. The teacher was going to send a note to her mother, but the Taliban took over first. "What are you crying for?" she asked Nuria, who couldn't stop sobbing. "I think a holiday is very nice." Parvana was sure the Taliban would let them go back to school in a few days. By then, her teacher would have forgotten all about sending a tattletale note to her mother. "You're just stupid," Nuria screamed at her. "Leave me alone." One of the difficulties of living with your whole family in one room was that it was impossible to really leave anyone alone. Wherever Nuria went, there was Parvana, and wherever Parvana went, there was Nuria. Both of Parvana's parents had come from old, respected Afghan families. With their educations, they had earned high salaries. They had had a big house with a courtyard and a couple of servants, a television set, a refrigerator, a car. Nuria had her own room. Parvana had shared a room with her little sister, Miriam. Miriam chattered a lot, but she thought Parvana was wonderful. It had certainly been wonderful to get away from Nuria sometimes. That house had been destroyed by a bomb. The family had moved several times since then. Each time, they moved to a smaller place. Every time their house was bombed, they lost more of their things. With each bomb, they got poorer. Now they lived together in one small room. There had been a war going on in Afghanistan for more than 20 years, twice as long as Parvana had been alive. At first, it was the Soviets who rolled their big tanks into the country and flew warplanes that dropped bombs on villages and the countryside. Parvana was born 1 month before the Soviets started going back to their own country. "You were such an ugly baby, the Soviets couldn't stand to be in the same country with you," Nuria was fond of telling her. "They fled back across the border in horror as fast as their tanks could carry them." After the Soviets left, the people who had been shooting at the Soviets decided they wanted to keep shooting at something, so they shot at each other. Many bombs fell on Kabul during that time. Many people died. Bombs had been part of Parvana's whole life. Every day, every night, rockets would fall out of the sky, and someone's house would explode. When the bombs fell, people ran. First they ran one way, then they ran another, trying to find a place where the bombs wouldn't find them. When she was younger, Parvana was carried. When she got bigger, she had to do her own running. Now most of the country was controlled by the Taliban. The word Taliban meant religious scholars. But Parvana's father told her that religion was about teaching people how to become better human beings, how to be kinder. The Taliban are not making Afghanistan a kinder place to live, he had said. Although bombs still fell on Kabul, they didn't fall as often as they used to. There was still a war going on in the north of the country, and that was where most of the killing took place these days. After a few more customers had come and gone, father suggested they end their work for the day. Parvana jumped to her feet, then collapsed back down again. Her foot was asleep. She rubbed it, then tried again. This time she was able to stand. First, she gathered up all the little items they were trying to sell, dishes, pillowcases, household ornaments that had survived the bombings. Like many Afghans, they sold what they could. Mother and Nuria regularly went through what was left of the family's belongings to see what they could spare. There were so many people selling things in Kabul, Parvana marveled that there was anyone left to buy them. Father packed his pens and writing paper in his shoulder bag. Leaning on his walking stick and taking Parvana's arm, he slowly stood up. Parvana shook the dust out of the blanket, folded it up, and they were on their way. For short distances, Father could manage with just his walking stick. For longer journeys, he needed Parvana to lean on. "You are just the right height," he said. "What will happen when I grow?" "Then I will grow with you." Father used to have a false leg, but he sold it. He hadn't planned to. False legs had to be specially made, and one person's false leg didn't necessarily fit another. But when a customer saw father's leg on the blanket, he ignored the other things for sale and demanded to buy the leg. He offered such a good price that father eventually relented. There were a lot of false legs for sale in the market now. Since the Taliban decreed that women must stay inside, many husbands took their wives' false legs away. "You're not going anywhere, so why do you need a leg?" they would ask. There were bombed out buildings all over Kabul. Neighborhoods had turned from homes and businesses into bricks and dust. Kabul had once been beautiful. Nuria remembered whole sidewalks, traffic lights that had changed color, evening trips to restaurants and cinemas, browsing in fine shops for clothes and books. For most of Pravana's life, the city had been in ruins, and it was hard for her to imagine it any other way. It hurt her to hear stories of old Kabul before the bombing. She didn't want to think about everything the bombs had taken away, including her father's health and their beautiful home. It made her angry. And since she could do nothing with her anger, it made her sad. They left the busy part of the market and turned down a side street to their building. Pravana carefully guided her father around the potholes and broken places in the road. How do women in Barak manage to walk along these streets? How do they see where they are going? They fall down a lot, her father replied. He was right. Pravana had seen them fall. She looked at her favorite mountain. It rose up majestically at the end of her street. "What's the name of that mountain?" she had asked her father soon after they moved to their new neighborhood. "That's Mount Pravana." "It is not," Nuria had said scornfully. "Oh, you shouldn't lie to the child," Mother had said. The whole family had been out walking together. In the time before the Taliban, Mother and Nuria just wore light scarves around their hair. Their faces soaked up the Kabul sunshine. "Mountains are named by people," Father said. "I am a person, and I named that mountain Pravana." Her mother gave in, laughing. Father laughed too, and Pravana and baby Miriam, who didn't even know why she was laughing. Even grumpy Nuria jumped in. The sound of the family's laughter scampered up Mount Pravana and back down into the street. Now Pravana and her father slowly made their way up the steps of their building. They lived on the third floor of an apartment building. It had been hit by a rocket attack, and half of it was in rubble. The stairs were on the outside of the building, zigzagging back and forth on their way up. They had been damaged by the bomb and didn't quite meet in places. Only some parts of the staircase had a railing. "Never rely on the railing," Father told Pravana over and over. Going up was easier for Father than going down, but it still took a long time. Finally, they reached the door of their home and went inside.